Good morning.
Did a good job renovating.
You did a really nice job.
Everyone, please keep eating, but welcome. I'm Kendall Bennett, President of the Colorado River Alliance Board of Directors. We are so pleased to have you with us today in downtown Austin, overlooking our favorite river, Colorado. Each year, this semi-annual Alliance program brings together prominent business, community, and environmental leaders to educate, inform, and discuss relevant and timely issues affecting the Colorado River. This morning's program couldn't be more timely or relevant in spite of last night's rain. Like water resources throughout Texas, the Colorado River is under tremendous stress right now. Drought, population growth, and increased demand are straining our river. While water conservation practices are critical to maintaining the health and flow of our river, additional strategies are being considered by today's leaders. Today's program will paint a picture of the current challenges facing our river and Texas water resources, and will explore the strategies our leaders are considering to meet our water challenges. Before we start, I would like to take a moment to recognize a few people who make this event possible. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Bob Barstow and the Barstow Foundation for their generous gift, which makes this event possible. I would also like to recognize my fellow board of directors, the Alliance Advisory Council members, the Alliance Tributary League and River Society members, and our staff and volunteers. If you remember one of these groups, would you please stand and be recognized? Last but not least, our underwriter 4-star and sponsors Plains Capital Bank, Bickerstaff Heath, Delgado Acosta, and Beal Consulting. And I'd like to thank you, the people in this room, who are committed to a healthy, flowing Colorado River and sustainable water resources in Texas. The Colorado River Alliance, based in Austin, is the only nonprofit organization in the state dedicated solely to the conservation and protection of the Texas-Colorado River. The Alliance has been an active voice for a healthy Colorado River since 1994. Our vision is a clean, abundant, accessible, and healthy Colorado River, and an alliance of communities and organizations who are dedicated to protecting it. Programs like the Barstow Speaker Series keep community leaders like you informed of the challenges facing our river, allowing us to build our alliances and developing the solutions needed to solve these challenges. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you two Colorado River experts. I will introduce our panel moderator, Mr. Joe Beal, in a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Paul Thornhill, who's here to set the stage for today's panel discussion. Paul is a well-known water expert in Texas. He has civil engineering and MBA degrees from the University of Texas in Austin. He spent time at the Texas Water Rights Commission before joining the consulting firm of SB Houston and Associates. Mr. Thornhill then spent 9 years at CH2M Hill before spending 12 years at LCRA. He is currently president of Paul Thornhill Engineering, Inc. Paul?
Thank you, Kendall. As he said, my job is to get you all worked up into a lather. I have my clock running. I'm supposed to quit at exactly 10 minutes, so whether I'm done or not, I'm going to quit. Now, many comments I've heard already about the fact that you can't have a water conference without a flood happening. This is no flood. This is just a nice little rain. 4 inches at my house, it all soaked in. We got very little runoff. Point out, droughts are often interspersed with significant floods. The 1946 to 1957 drought of record, as we call it, was pummeled in September of 1951 by one of the largest floods on record. Lake Travis came up 56 feet in 12 hours, about 65 feet in 24 hours, refilled to within 5 feet of full. 4 years later, it was empty again. So don't get complacent thinking that this rain is going to help us. So what does this drought look like? The drought we're in really has lasted for quite a few years. The peak of the drought I would call October of 2011, when 100% of the state was in a drought status and 88% of the state was in exceptional drought. Today, 83% of the state is in some sort of drought status and only 3% in exceptional drought. So we've sort of climbed out of it a little bit. But what did we have? We had water restrictions imposed virtually everywhere. We had starving cattle. We had raging wildfires. Remember the Bastrop Fire? Agricultural losses estimated at more than $7 billion. LCRA cut off the downstream irrigators for the first time in their history, and that continues today. At least 23 public water supply systems were less than 6 months from running out of water. Some towns did run out of water, like Spicewood Beach up on Lake Travis. We had interstate and international conflict. Texas has relationships with Mexico, with New Mexico, with Oklahoma and Louisiana, which were stressed by the drought. Is Texas ready for a drought like the 1950s? The 1950s sort of being the gold standard, although this one is at or beyond that already. Or, more importantly, are we ready for a decades-long mega drought that many tree ring and other types of studies have indicated have happened frequently in the last 500 years? Take this, for example. In the 1950s drought, the Austin population was 145,000 people. The contents of the Highland Lakes fell to a little bit below where they are today. Today, the population is 843,000 people. So just in Austin, we have 5.8 times as many people relying on the same remnant water supply as we had in the 1950s. The state's per capita water storage requirement hasn't grown as fast as the population. Since 1980, our per capita storage has fallen by over 30%. This is in surface reservoirs. Should we stick with surface reservoirs? Many today are at or near empty or well on their way to empty. Of the 114 major reservoirs in Texas used for water supply, 34 of these are less than 38% full. Theoretically, these 34 reservoirs, just that third, should hold about 10 million acre feet. Today, they hold less than 2 million acre feet. So should we switch to groundwater? If you take the total storage that's theoretically available in all 114 major surface reservoirs in the state of Texas, that's 33 million acre feet. If you look just south of here, under Lee and Bastrop counties, in just the Simsboro aquifer, there's 46 million acre feet in storage. So 1.5 times the amount in every reservoir in Texas is under 2 counties south of here in just 1 out of 8 aquifers under those counties. Now remember, I'm supposed to work you up. Don't check my facts too close. The total volume of groundwater pumped in the entire state of Texas from the 1930s to 2005, the total amount of groundwater was 530 million acre feet. That's every drop that's ever been used on the Ogallala and the Panhandle. That's all the city of Houston's pumpage. That's all of San Antonio's pumpage from the Edwards. Add all those up, it's 530 million acre feet. In Lee and Bastrop counties, there's 288 million acre feet of groundwater. Just those 2 counties could supply 50% of every drop of groundwater that's been used for the last 75 years. Should we go with aquifer storage and recovery? Some people have done that. San Antonio, massive, excellent project. El Paso, Kerrville, North Las Vegas, Florida, many places around the world. What about rainwater collection? That always pops up as an option during a drought. Well, it's encouraged in Texas, although there had to be some legislation to clarify the ability of neighborhood associations to limit it or not. But did you know that it's illegal in Colorado to do rainwater collection? The Water Supreme Court in Colorado has declared that a drop of water falling on your roof is already owned by somebody else downstream. They extend the prior appropriation document to when the water hits the ground, not entering a water course like they do in Texas. What about direct reuse of wastewater? I think we're going to hear a little bit about that today. Big Spring and Wichita Falls are certainly looking at that. What about everywhere else? Lake Mead is at record levels. It's down about 140 feet. I'm sure you all have seen that in the news. California has replaced Texas as the most drought-stricken state. There's a huge surge in groundwater use going on in California. California has no regulation of groundwater. Their legislature recently grappled with, should they pass some sort of legislation. I'm unsure of the exact status and what that legislation said, but I understand they did pass something a week or so ago. When California goes south, everybody's food prices go up. They're responsible for 79 major crops and the major proportion of the livestock produced in the U.S. But unlike Texas, California's droughts are driven by change in snowfall patterns driven by what some would claim is climate change. When today, the precipitation in California falls more as rainfall, less as snow. What that means is it runs off, just like we're used to. In California, they're not used to that. They're used to the water dribbling out of the mountains over about a 5-month period instead of coming overnight in one flood. Clovis, New Mexico. They've asked for a federal grant to pay irrigators $400 an acre not to farm, theoretically leaving the water there for Clovis. San Antonio Water System has a standing offer of $5,000 an acre foot for permitted water out of the Edwards. You look at their agenda every month or so, you'll see an agenda item of them buying water. But perversely, remember the Atlanta drought in Georgia about 4 years ago? Massive floods into that drought. We don't hear anything about it anymore. We've used the 1950s drought since 1958 to define our acceptable risk to building infrastructure to carry water for us forward. The Highland Lakes and every permit in the state of Texas for municipal use is based on firm yield based on the 50s drought. But that has begun to change. We're finding many recalculations of the firm yield of reservoirs based on this current drought, and in some areas based on droughts that were 10 or 15 years ago. Tree ring studies tell us that this drought that we're having and the one we had in the 50s are essentially very small in the grand scheme of things. There's at least a 10% chance that we could have a 50-year mega drought. Imagine this happening for 50 years. In essence, the Chihuahuan Desert moves to Austin, Texas instead of Monterey, Mexico. That's what it would look like. So what do the actual data say about our climate here in Texas? You can go to various NOAA websites and play with their computers, and it's just fascinating. Generally, since 1958, runoff statewide was increasing, but since 1997, it has fallen dramatically. Runoff in 2011 and 2013 were the two lowest years since 1917. That's a 100-year record. We're seeing lowest, extremes. Temperatures statewide have been on the rise since 1975. It's an amazing graph when you go look at it. Average temperatures have risen over 2 degrees. Well, you think 2 degrees isn't much? Well, 2 degrees on an average of 82 gets you to 84. It changes a lot of things. As expected, when you have higher temperatures, precipitation statewide has been declining. We've, on average, lost 7 inches of average rainfall in the state since 1990. Economic impacts are rather severe. One that I ran across that I think is really interesting is in a January report, the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce warned that a truly disastrous drought would throw 135,000 residents out of work. Okay, it's a published report done by the Chamber. But what was interesting in there was this concept of competition. The study argued that locking up even more supplies would give San Antonio, quote, an advantage at a time when many other communities are struggling to provide water infrastructure, end quote. And so are we going to compete for diminished and reduced water supplies, or are we going to share those statewide? With that, I'll turn it back to Kendall and look forward to our panel answering some of these questions.
Thank you, Paul, for that extremely compelling introduction. Before our panelists respond, we must introduce today's moderator, who, quite frankly, needs no introduction to most of the people in this room, my fellow board member and friend, Joe Beal. Mr. Beal has served as member of the Colorado River Alliance Board of Directors since 2008 and has extensive experience in the water and energy sector. Mr. Beal spent 19 years with SB Houston and Associates, Austin, and 2 years at the Texas Water Quality Board. 4 years after joining LCRA in 1995, Mr. Beal was tapped to serve as LCRA's 8th General Manager and Chief Executive Officer. Under his leadership, LCRA penned a $100 million long-term water supply agreement with the City of Austin. Thank you, Joe. Implemented a 10-year, $173 million project to modernize and upgrade 6 major dams and hydroelectric facilities, expanded transmission services into South and West Texas, and created a nonprofit transmission affiliate with projected capital investments of $1 billion in the next 5 years. Built a highly efficient 536 megawatt natural gas power plant, and obtained a unique state flex permit to reduce air emissions from the Fayette Power Project. He also carried LCRA into the business of water and wastewater utility services. Mr. Beal is currently president of Beal Consulting. Please help me welcome our moderator, Mr. Joe Beal.
Good morning. Good morning. You know, Kendall said I did all those things. I didn't do them. LCRA did them. And they continue to do wonderful things. What we're going to do here today is something different than what we have done at these previous luncheons. We have 4 true experts up here who have fought the battle when it comes to reacting and doing something about drought. And I have asked them to focus on some particular issues, not the least of which is, how do you know when you're finally in a drought, and what do you do? What did you do? How did you do it? What did the people that you served do? Were they behind you or against you? What happened to rates? Those real-life things that people that are responsible for water supplies have to think about. The way we're going to do this, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to ask each of them to take about 5 minutes and give you the essence of their experience, and each of their experiences are different. And then we'll go into a Q&A. I'll ask some questions to the panel, and any of them can volunteer to answer. And then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Hopefully we'll have some time at the very end. So if you've got questions that start creeping into your mind as we're having this discussion this morning, hold them, and hopefully I'll be able to get to you, and you can ask the panelist yourself whatever your questions are. Now, to introduce everybody, Phil Wilson is down at the end. Everybody knows Phil, General Manager at LCRA. And as I said, LCRA continues to do great things to serve the people here in Central Texas. Phil may tell us about some of the actions that the LCRA board took yesterday that were extremely meaningful. John Grant is next to Phil. John is the General Manager of CRMWD, the Colorado River Municipal Water District. When you think about his area, think about San Angelo, Odessa, Big Spring, Snyder, that part of the state. John is responsible for water supplies in that part of the state. Today, the LCRA reservoirs, they might have gone up just a little bit last night, but they're at roughly 34% full. John has 3 reservoirs, 2 of which are less than 2% full, unless they caught some rain in the last 24 hours or so.
He's taking all my notes.
One of which has only about 16%. So, I mean, he's in a lot worse shape from having enough supply for what he's responsible for, even than we are down in the lower part. Next to John is Ed Archuleta. Ed today is with the University of Texas at El Paso, but he has spent the majority of his career in arid areas of the West, not the least of which is the city of El Paso, where he was Director of Water and Wastewater Utilities. El Paso continues to grow. I was looking at the population estimates over time yesterday. They continue to have steady growth. They're at 675,000 people now, and continuing to grow. So not only does Ed have to deal with continuing drought, sometimes it's worse than others, but he's got that steady increase of population out there that is demanding virtually the same water resource. And then Kent Satterwhite, immediately to my left, is the general manager of the Canadian River Municipal Water Authority. This is the entity that serves from Amarillo down to Lubbock and south of Lubbock, all those little towns out there in the Panhandle. He has both surface water and underground water, and he's experienced shortages on both of those over time, and so he's got a unique set of experiences that I think he can share with us as well. So we have a group of very, very well-informed people, and each of them will give you a different outlook, I think. Let's start with John Grant. John, why don't you take just a few minutes and let folks know what your drought experiences have looked like.
Joe, thanks. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to share kind of our water experiences, our drought with y'all down here. And as Joe said, I just want to kind of get started with a little background. And our area is the Upper Colorado Basin. I told Phil just a second ago, I'll just call us the Highland Lake system of the North, and we'll leave it at that. But our area really starts at the Ivy Reservoir, which is in Concho and Coleman counties. We pick up the Permian Basin, Concho Valley areas of the state are really our geographic surface area. When you think about that area, think of oil and gas severance tax, rainy day fund. That's where the money came from to fund all the new SWIFT funding at the Water Development Board. Our major municipal customers are Odessa, Big Spring, and Snyder. We supply 100% of their water. San Angelo, we supply 80 to 90% of their water needs. Midland, 70 to 80%. Abilene, 15 to 20%. We cover a large geographic area, and I think in the 2010 census, the population that we served was about 500,000 people. Over the years, our main source of supply has been surface water, and our lakes, just like y'all's are down here, are used for surface water supply and recreation. So we have those challenges and issues we have to deal with. We do have 3 major reservoirs. They're all on the main stem of the Colorado River. Lake J.B. Thomas was built in the early 50s. E.V. Spence in Coke County was built in the late 60s. And the Ivy Reservoir was built in 1991. We've got about 1.2 million acre feet of total storage capacity. And today, between all 3 lakes, we've got about 107,000 acre feet total. We're about 8.5% full. And I think Joe had mentioned, and I'd looked, I think the Highland Lake system is around 34% full today. The Ivy Reservoir is about 17% full. We're still pumping water out of it. The Spence Reservoir is under 2% full, but amazingly, we're still pumping water out of it today. Thomas, again, is less than 2% full, but we're pumping water out of that today. And you go, well, how do you do that? Well, you're just aware of your situation. And, you know, one of the things that we've learned to do over time is put floating barge pumps out in the lakes and actually pump water from the low spots in the lakes actually back to our pump stations on the edge of the lake. It's not uncommon for us to do that. One of these days I'd like to see us not have to do that, but it's just something that we've grown accustomed to up there. Groundwater became a part of our system actually before surface water did. We brought groundwater in the early 50s, but because of the drought of the 70s, we actually went to Ward County and developed a well field in Ward County. So groundwater has been a portion and a source of supply for the district for a long time. You know, issues that we face out there are drought, and it seems like we're always in some sort of a drought. I've been out there since '95 and never not seen us in a drought. Oil and gas, we're seeing a lot of oil and gas activity. With that comes water needs for oil and gas, but it also brings population with it. And one of the bigger challenges that we have is looking for fresh water. We don't have any fresh water, so we're dealing with brackish water. Over time, we've implemented kind of not a conservation program, but a water awareness program. I think it's real important that people be aware of the water situation where they live. In our area, our rainfall ranges from 13 inches a year in Odessa to 22 inches a year in Snyder. Our evaporation rate is about 70 inches a year. So we really start out in the hole. One of the things that we like to talk to people about is on education is if you water your yard a half an inch per week or 1 inch every other week, that's 26 inches a year. That's more rainfall than Snyder gets in a year. So you need to be aware of your situation. I always talk to folks, go look outside the city limits, and does inside the city limits look like outside the city limits? One of the other experiences that I've had and learned over the last few years with this drought, you can't conserve your way out of a drought. You've got to be proactive and you've got to do things. We have surface water and groundwater as sources, but we've also looked at other sources. And we do, I think by what people will tell you, that CRMWD built the first direct potable reuse plant in Texas. Well, when we started this project in 2002, it wasn't because of the current drought. It was because we were actively seeking other water supplies. And that may be something that we look for in the future. We've also looked at brush control, salt cedar control, to try to see what we can do there. We're looking down the road for future projects. We're looking to increase our groundwater supplies. We want to maintain continued awareness as far as water goes. I don't see near as much water running down the road as I did 15 years ago.
John, let me go ahead and stop here if I could, and we'll pick up on some other items in just a minute. Kent, you want to talk to us about the Canadian River?
Sure. Does that work? Okay. Our story is really more about drought and trying to maintain what we had rather than growth. Growth hadn't been a big problem for us. We supply water to 11 member cities in the Texas Panhandle and South Plains. The average population is from 800 people to 230,000 people, 240 miles from north to south on our system. Very different needs and capabilities, and just trying to make one plan fit all doesn't work all that well. Lake Meredith has been our only source of water for a long, long time. It was drying up faster than we ever imagined would be possible. In 2000, the lake had 94 feet of water. It would eventually go to 26 feet. In 2001, we set an all-time record low for low inflow. We'd go on to break that record 10 times in the next 13 years. Looks like this year is going to make it 11 out of 14. And then those 3 years weren't anything to write home about. They were all below average. During that run of time, Lake Meredith lost 96% of its storage volume. 96%. It wasn't completely dry, but it was way too low to use, just to even get the water out, and certainly too salty to use. We think several things combined to tip the scales against Lake Meredith. Certainly irrigation in our watershed was one issue. Lowered the water table and therefore lowering the base flow in the river. Salt cedar moved into our riverbed and just kind of took over, and it was using tons of water. But really, we think the main issue was just the weather patterns had changed. We were still getting some rain, but just not the kind of rain with the intensity that would create any runoff at all. To try to help minimize the effects of this drought, we've started a salt cedar control project, and we've been doing that for over a decade, and we have that under control. We've done some channel work and to try to make things more efficient, but to ever get back to where we feel comfortable and have a secure water supply, it was obvious that groundwater was where we were going to go. Lake Meredith supplied 100% of our water for the first 3 decades, and then during the last decade we've converted to 100% well water. We went from 0 groundwater holdings to being one of the largest groundwater owners in the nation. But we really didn't have any other good options on all this. Well, we wouldn't have had to buy as much as we did, but groundwater clearly was the only way we could go. And there were certainly no other decent reservoir sites in our area. And even if there was, looking at Lake Meredith, what had happened there, it wouldn't have made any sense anyway. We were just really lucky to have a aquifer nearby with lots of high quality groundwater, virtually untapped, and at a reasonable distance. And we started buying that water as fast as funds would allow. Few years later, we had the opportunity to buy T. Boone Pickens's water, which nearly doubled our supply. It just seems like the stars all lined up to make groundwater available to us to make us look really smart.
Good, thanks, Kent. Ed, I'm going to call on you next, and Phil, I'll ask you to finish up at the end.
Thank you, Joe, and good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address you this afternoon. So we'll go to far west Texas, 8 inches of rain per year, maybe. It can vary from 4 inches to maybe 12 inches on a given year, but it's obviously high desert, very dry, arid conditions. We do have about 750,000 people we serve in the city and outside the city, and as Joe indicated, we're growing, steady growth all the time. We do have 2 groundwater aquifers. If you've been to El Paso, we have the mountains that separate the east from the west. On the east side is the Hueco Bolson, which is shared with New Mexico and Mexico. On the west side, we have the Mesilla, which is shared again with New Mexico and Mexico. So managing water in this area is very complex because of the different laws that govern water. In Mexico, it's all federal. In New Mexico, it's prior appropriation by permit from the state engineer. And in Texas, of course, it's the rule of capture. We do not have a groundwater conservation district because the city was very visionary, in my opinion, back in the 1950s when they created the Public Service Board that I worked for that would govern the water utility and kind of took it out of the politics as much as possible with regard to managing water. At the same time, they bought about 30,000 acres of land in the El Paso area. Back then, it was outside the city. A lot of it, not as much was known as we know today about the groundwater situation, but nonetheless, with the state laws with regard to right of capture, they acquired all that land, and from time to time, we sell some of that land for development, but we hold it for its groundwater rights, and a lot of it also has surface water rights on the river. So we have the 2 aquifers, and of course, we have the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande is a treaty between the United States and Mexico, a 1906 treaty. We're a customer of an irrigation district. There's one in New Mexico above us and one in Texas that we have to work with. We're their customer for irrigation. And then, of course, there's a compact among Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas that delivers water from Colorado to New Mexico and New Mexico to Texas. And so all of those kind of issues make it fairly complex to manage water in a binational, tri-state region, including Chihuahua, Mexico. But nonetheless, when I came there in '89, the conditions were the groundwater table on the Hueco was dropping about 1.5 feet to 3 feet per year. And based on information from the Texas Water Development Board, we were a city that was going to run out of water if we continued doing what we're doing. We were in litigation with the state of New Mexico. El Paso had filed suit to import water from New Mexico. New Mexico didn't like that, of course, and they fought back. There were 10 years worth of litigation, and nothing was really happening to advance at least El Paso's position. So the board asked me, what can we do? After I'd been there about 6 months and look at the lay of the land, so to speak, I decided to recommend to them to develop a 50-year plan for water, which was the first time El Paso had done a 50-year plan for water. Because I told them, I think if we diversify what we do, I think we can do much better than what we're doing today. So that's what we did. We finished the plan. There was a lot of community input into that plan. It was finished a year and a half later, and we began to implement the plan. Basically, it's an integrated plan. It's a total water management plan, if you might say. Looking at everything associated with it. It starts with conservation. I think most of you know we have a very aggressive and very successful conservation program. Back then, we were using about 200 gallons per person per day. Today, it's about 132. So we've dropped about 35% in that period of time. Reclaimed water, we had an aquifer storage and recovery plant using indirect potable reuse that was built in '85. We were serving a golf course, but that was about it. As part of the plan, we started implementing reclaimed water. We have about 50 miles of pipeline in the ground today that serves golf courses, parks, school grounds, big apartment complexes, cemeteries, also industrial use, a power plant. So that's helped a lot. One of the real things that I saw in conservation and reuse is to lower the peak demand on the potable system. As I said, back in 1990, our peak demand on a hot summer day was about 200 million gallons per day. Today, with about another 275,000 people, our peak demand is about 155 to 160. So, you know, one of the strategies that we saw, aside from reducing per capita demand, was to reduce the peak demand, and that's really helped us, saved us a lot of money in capital and operating costs. The other thing was we had a 40 million gallon per day surface water plant from the river that was built in '43. We decided that we would start buying water rights and leasing water rights and working with the irrigation district rather than litigating. And we added another 60 million gallons per day in a new plant, and that's helped us. So the strategy was when there's surface water, when there's snowpack in Colorado and northern New Mexico, we'll take the surface water. When there's not, we'll do the reclaimed water all the time. We'll do the conservation all the time, and then we'll start looking into desalination. So what we did is we started looking at desalination in the early 90s. I visited plants in Florida and other places throughout the world. We started a pilot plant and found the water to be treatable. We worked with the USGS and did a groundwater model to characterize the water flow and quantity of water. And also at the same time, we bought 2 big ranches and farms east of El Paso, many miles away, but as a future insurance policy for importation someday. So basically, our strategy has been multi-phased. Use all the water strategies that are available to us. Today, the aquifer is stable. It's not dropping. We have no water restrictions we have best management practices, what we call it, year-round with regard to conservation. The river drought continues. It's been 16 years now since the drought started on the river. So our issue is not rainfall, like most of Texas. It's lack of snowfall. And the way conditions are, if you go back into the 50s, it took 35 years for Elephant Butte Dam, that's 100 miles north of us, holds 2 million acre feet to fill. Today, it's less than 10% full. So the strategy is use surface water and supplement it with groundwater. When surface water is not there, you pump more groundwater, and groundwater that you've stored or at least haven't relied upon. So what the utility is doing now is getting ready to go to direct potable reuse for 10 million gallons per day. The planning's been done. The pilot plant work will start next year. The desalination, we built that K. Bailey Hutchison desalination plant and started operation in 2007. There's a lot of brackish water in the area. As part of the drought in the early 2000s, we also equipped 11 wells with reverse osmosis systems to also help with the peak demand that occurs in the summertime. Thank you very much.
Good, thanks, Ed. Two comments on Ed's comments. Both Ed and John Grant have used the term direct potable reuse. That's a real nice way of saying taking water directly from the sewage treatment plant and treating it more and putting it back into the drinking water system, as opposed to indirect wastewater reuse, which is where you soak it into the ground and then finally pull it back out again. The other thing Ed talked about was a couple of farms or ranches that will be a long-term future water supply. Those are down by Marfa. At least one of them is down by Marfa, Texas. So, you know, we're talking more than 100 miles of pipeline ultimately that'll take that water back uphill to El Paso. Philip, how about LCRA?
Morning or afternoon now. Glad to be here today. Last night was kind of fun. It reminded me when I was growing up as a boy in San Angelo and Abilene watching a thunderstorm coming in. Not much else to do out that way. Rain. You stood for hours. I want to introduce a couple people real quick. Lori Berger is one of our directors for LCRA. Lori, glad to have her here. I don't know if I have any other ones here today. I didn't see anybody. John Hoffman, Executive Vice President of Water for us, and Karen Bodney, Senior Vice President of Water Resources. They're the ones who do all the working and thinking every day and do a great job on this. Glad to be here. We've been very busy at LCRA, and I'll spend a couple of minutes on that. And I look forward to getting to the questions from you and the panel as we go forward. We've been talking a lot about we need to do something, and I think LCRA in the past few months, and especially yesterday, did something on water supply. Our board set a goal a few years ago of trying to reach 100,000 acre feet of new water supply. And we've been making incremental progress on that, 10,000 acre feet of groundwater in Lost Pines. And then yesterday we voted to build a 40,000 acre foot reservoir in Lane City and Wharton County, which will turn over a couple times a year and add 90,000 acre feet of new supply. That's a very substantial investment for LCRA, for the region. It cost us about $215 million to build, and it will provide water both for firm and interruptible. It'll be done in 2 years, which is extraordinary. So we are going to start turning dirt in the next 30 to 45 days to go with that real quick. And that's part of supplying what we need for the future. The reservoir will help meet both firm and interruptible, as I said, and we're getting a loan from the Water Development Board, and a very exciting project for us. We've also taken other significant steps. We suspended releases of Highland Lakes water with permission from the state for most downstream agriculture users for the first time ever in 2012. It happened again in 2013 and in 2014. We're also requiring our firm water customers to limit outdoor watering to no more than once a week. And we're increasing our efforts to require people who take water from the Highland Lakes without proper authorization to get a contract or face the TCQ for penalties involved with that, because if you take a resource, you need to pay for it. Wherever you are in the process, it's the right thing to do. We're also amending our water management plan. The board voted on that yesterday unanimously, which, by the way, is the only one of its kind in the state. We've been working with stakeholders, the TCQ, on revisions of the plan, and the board gave us the green light yesterday to revise the application we first made in 2012 to amend that plan. In a nutshell, our revised application protects the water supply for firm customers, gives LCRA more flexibility in managing the lakes during times of drought, and improves the reliability of agricultural water by reducing the chance that water will be cut back or cut off. So now we'll send an application to TCQ in the next couple of months to go forward. And if you were involved in the stakeholder process, I see many of you out there who were, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your passion, and for making our plan better in the process for all the stakeholders and the citizens of this region. I'd like to also offer my appreciation to our largest firm water customer, and one that is a leader in water conservation. That's the city of Austin. And Austin and LCRA are the two largest water rights holder in the lower Colorado River Basin, and our relationship goes back all the way to the 1930s. We work together on many, many issues, and we appreciate having a partner like Austin, and they've been very forward-thinking in what they do. Let me wrap the remarks with some good news, and I'm looking forward to diving into this more. We're not going to run out of water, but that doesn't mean that we don't have all the water we want. If lake levels continue to fall, we'll begin requiring firm customers, such as the city of Austin, to come back on use. We hope that doesn't happen. We hope we have an El Nino sometime this fall going forward. But if that doesn't, we're okay. We're taking the action we need to protect and extend the water supply. When it comes to water right now, and we'll get into this more, we have the water we need, but we need the right time, the right price, and the right kind. And a lot of technologies have been talked about today, and work in El Paso is a great example of multi-use approach to this. But there are policy changes we have to consider. The legislature will take up this spring when they come back. There are things the state ought to do as well. I want to talk about that, some of the transportation side. And how do we ensure we start pricing water more like a commodity than it is for future supply development as we go forward? We don't treat it like anything else because we had a great day yesterday with rain, but that doesn't make a plan because it rains. So I'm glad to be here today. I look forward to the conversation, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. I want to come back in a few minutes and ask about the recommendations for policy changes, particularly legislatively, that any of you all might have. I too believe that before we're going to be able to solve the statewide water supply problem, we're going to have to get to the point where we can move water around the state. And we are inhibited from doing that today with policies, regulations, and laws that exist. But maybe some of our panelists can give some specifics. This is a general question for any of you all that want to respond. When was it that you decided you had to do something different from what you were doing as it relates to responding to drought or responding to population increase? Was there a particular trigger that caused you to say, I got to do something and I got to start on it now?
I can start. As I mentioned, we started our planning process in 91, but we knew that the river, even though we were buying water rights on the river, that it would be dry at some point in time, or at least there would be reduced, availability of water. So we started looking at desalination. The drought on the Rio Grande, in our part of the Rio Grande, started in 1998, like I said, about 16 years ago. In 2002, 2003 is when we started to see significant cutbacks by the Bureau of Reclamation and the irrigation districts. And so I went to my board and I said, look, we've done pilot plant work on desalination. We've got some wells close to the river that used to be brackish and have high arsenic, but if we go to RO, reverse osmosis, we can put those wells back into service. So we had a fast-track project where we installed 11 1 million gallon per day reverse osmosis desalination plant, and that got us through the peak. Then the second time the second signal was a continuing drought, and in 2004, 2005, we decided to pull the trigger and work on the desalination plant. We built a 27.5 million gallon per day plant, which is the largest in the country, in the world actually, inland. And for the first time, we went with the Department of Defense. The plant is located on Fort Bliss property. We had to do a lot of legwork with the Army, with the Pentagon, with the Congress, and that's where Kay Bailey really helped out. So we built the plant, and it's really saved us. If we didn't have that plant today, we would have restrictions in El Paso the last 2 or 3 years for sure.
Kent or John?
Just real quickly, I think probably CRMWD saw this in 1971, because when we completed the Spence Reservoir, it didn't rain, and we were sitting there with an empty reservoir, so we had to move forward at that time and develop our first groundwater system. So I think as far as when did we recognize it, probably in 71. We've seen over the years that the yields of our reservoirs are not what they once were, so we began trying to acquire groundwater. Most of the fresh groundwater was taken, so we've started looking toward reuse and desalinization.
Kent?
Well, we weren't as far-sighted as John. We were, in 1990, 2000, things were looking really good. We were full. 2001, we broke that all-time record, as I said. We broke it again. The next year, we did the math on what are the odds of breaking an all-time record 3 years in a row. It was clear it wasn't going to happen. We broke it again the third year, and that kind of woke us up. It was time to go to work. That was one of our triggers. The other trigger was T. Boone Pickens. He was a well-known oil man that lived in Amarillo, had a major falling out with Amarillo and moved his operation to Dallas, left, a lot of people had a bad taste in their mouth from that. He was trying to put together a deal to sell Panhandle water to Dallas or San Antonio or El Paso, and his proposed project was literally across the fence from us. And I think these two things came together to motivate our cities to get out the checkbook.
Phil?
I'm parachuted into a drought.
Well, you picked a good time to come. Within LCRA, you all have stepped out on that off-channel storage facility, and you've declared that you're going to develop some underground water in Bastrop County. But to do that, you had to gain support of first your board and then the public. Was it difficult gaining public support? Did you have much pushback? And do you expect much pushback as you actually implement those plans?
I think in the big picture, the reservoir is relatively easy from a public perception standpoint. It's going to be 90,000 acre feet. Keep 110,000 acre feet of water in the reservoirs because of evaporative loss and water movement, et cetera. So, you got to pay for it, and we figured some creative ways to do that. That's always a challenge. But from a policy standpoint, the reservoir, I think, is a fairly common sense approach where we're trying to get to from a new supply standpoint. The groundwater is a whole other game. And part of it is that we're living in their last century's rules and regulations where we didn't have the kind of growth we've got. We have a new Texan every 2 minutes. More than 1,000 people a day moving to the state. And they're not bringing their water with them. And so that kind of pressure puts extraordinary pressures on us as a state as a whole and all infrastructure. And so you've got these groundwater districts which were created for noble intentions but did not anticipate the kind of growth we'd have as a state. And there's this perception that it's their water in those districts. And then you've got a second part of that which says, if I own that land, then the groundwater district can then dictate terms for 5 years. Well, if you're going to make a capital investment that's significant to use that for conjunctive use, it's hard to go to the market to borrow money. If someone's going to tell you, well, I can only guarantee your level for 5 years, and then I may give you a 20% haircut. And then I can give you another 20% haircut. So that process, it becomes very problematic to plan to a business cycle. So I think the legislature, your question on policy, you're going to have local buy-in, this inherent tension between urban and rural and growth and where we have the water. But I guess back to my point a moment ago, which is we have enough water if used the right way and the right price. But you have to have the access to it and the transportation with it. So I think that is going to be a very thorny conversation and one that we need to have, but it's going to be tough. And it goes back to where do we want to go as a state for growth standpoint, because that's the question number one economic development will ask. Do you have the water we need? And then you answer all those about power and about schools and about roads and everything people want to do when it comes to job creation. And you've got to get past this, it's mine, from my people in my county. And I will use one quick story that's illustrative to that. So I had the chance to work at TxDOT before I came here. Counties built roads before the highway department was created. So you'd have a road from Travis County to Bastrop County or to Williamson County, and it would end when the county commissioners decided where it would end. So Travis County's road would end here, and Bastrop's would end here. Or Williamson County would end here, and Travis would end there. I did that reverse. But the point was, because they decided where the road would end, that's where it ended. So the state of Texas said, that's not how we plan highways. We need to have connectivity. We need to have people get from point A to point B. And that same logic, in my mind, applies to some of these water transportation issues, whether it's transmission, pipelines, et cetera, of how we get there, because we have to think past what we've done in the past, how we're going to do it in the future. And that's very important for policy and for full utilization of our resources, which people will pay for.
We have Judge Paul Poppy in the audience in Bastrop County, which is where the underground water is that LCRA is developing. So when we come around to Q&A from the audience, Paul, you can ask whatever question you have just written down. Okay, John Grant, you've got people in Big Spring drinking wastewater. How'd you make that happen? How'd you get public support for that?
I think when we started this, and that probably the public participation phase, the meetings, was back in 2008. Quite honestly, it really wasn't hard. When we first started talking about it, we would go to Rotary clubs and talk to folks, and one of the first comments I got, well, why didn't CRMWD do this sooner? And I said, well, because the technology really wasn't that good then, and it cost a lot to do it. I think probably to the benefit of our project, I think people in West Texas, when you get 13 inches of rain a year, you put a different value and appreciation on water. And I think that probably worked in our favor as we move forward with the projects. You also want to keep it on a light note too. Probably one of the more favorite comments that I've heard through our whole process was an elderly gentleman said, "Good, I get to drink my beer twice."
I used to say the good news is that people in Texas are now willing to drink their own sewage. The bad news is there's just not enough of it. So Kent, up in the Panhandle, you all built a major reservoir and pump stations and pipelines, and then declared that you were going to have to get a whole new water supply, and even one that came from a controversial Boone Pickens. And by the way, I was fortunate enough to consult with Mr. Pickens a bit on that water, and where that water should have gone, believe it or not, to make the most money off of it, was to the eastern slope of the Rockies above Denver, where they would be willing to pay, what, Paul, $20,000 an acre foot? A significant amount of money, and it stayed where it was supposed to stay. But how in the world did you get your 11 cities that you serve, and the customers of Kent are municipalities, how did you get them to agree that you had to go create a whole new water supply once you'd built that lake?
Well, Lake Meredith's decline was top story. It seems like every other day. I mean, it was big news. The media was really kind to us. I said every other day. The other day, the top story was Pickens's project taking our water to the south, and so I mean, it just made it work. I mean, the public was behind us 100% all the way on these projects, just because the media was good to us for one thing, and it was the logical thing to do. There weren't any other options, and it's either do that or move.
Ed, did you have any problem with the public as you tried to diversify your water supplies out there?
Well, initially, when we first developed the plan, and I had to go out to the Rotary clubs and all the League of Women Voters and what have you, and we asked people to start watering even, water odd, water only certain hours of the day. It was tough, I had one person said, "You're from New Mexico, right?" And I said, "Well, this is Texas. We don't conserve water here in Texas." That was back in 1990. Today, it's a whole different world, but it was tough at first, particularly the water conservation. The reclaimed water program, the indirect potable reuse, which is basically taking wastewater to drinking water standards and injecting it into the aquifer, that was done in the late 70s and early 80s, and I think as a result of that, a lot of people were pretty used to the fact that we've got to look at alternative water supplies. But of course, we had to raise rates as well. Maybe we'll talk about that in a few minutes if we have time. But since then, the public has really embraced and accepted, a variety of options, and basically the community is doing very well and very. I learned a long time ago. I got my master's in sanitary engineering, which is not offered today. Back in those days, everything was based on public health. And then with the Clean Water Act in '72, amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act in the '80s, everything switched to heavy metals and then all types of contaminants, in the water supply or potentially. And so I learned years ago that water really means economic development, and that's what it means to Texas. And so if you can convince the people like you, the movers and shakers in the community, that water is very important to sustain the economy and to provide for the population growth, I think people will accept that. Because they know, I think they know that today's technology and today's managers and what have you basically can deliver safe drinking water. And the technology, when you think about it, we call it de facto water reuse. De facto water reuse means that there's wastewater plants dump it into a lake or streams, and then somebody else downstream picks it up. And so many times, if not all the time, because of the advances we've made in wastewater treatment, the water coming out of a wastewater treatment plant is a lot better quality than what might be in that river. But somehow everybody thinks that, we're on this is clear water coming down the river, and for some reason the wastewater might pollute it, but it's almost turned out to be the opposite, where wastewater coming out of modern day wastewater treatment plants. And then if you add advanced water treatment to that to make it potable, then the technology is just there. It's just there. it's mostly the public acceptance.
Good. You've talked about rate impacts, and as you go to these more heroic efforts, I am sure that there's a greater cost involved. And you talked about economic development, and water means economic development. Personally, I think it would be a wonderful idea if we had whoever the professional was that worked for San Antonio that determined the economic impact of not having enough water. If that same consultant or one that could do the same kind of work would do that for this Austin area, I think that's important. But what about rate impacts, Phil? You have increased, and I think are projecting to continue to increase the rates you're going to use for your farm water, and I assume for your interruptible water. Are those significant? Is the public accepting those rate increases? Are you getting pushback, or are people willing to pay for the cost of water?
Well, I think in general, people are not willing to pay for the cost of anything. It's human nature, or whatever it is. Having said that, we implemented a drought rate for this year of $176 an acre foot from $151. It'll be a one-year rate that goes into effect in January. We're going to see whether we get any rain to sell interruptible water this spring, which will allow us to move that rate back down, hopefully to approximately the same level if we get that. So basically the way it works economically, you know how much you have to pay for in your operation. We run the River Operations Center, which last night kept track of all the water coming in. We have Hydromet, which is a great website if you want to check out really cool things on how much water is going to the gauges. We also run the dam. We do the dam safety. We run all those activities associated with infrastructure. You have fixed costs each and every day, and that costs about $35 to $36 million a year for LCRA to take care of that. So we sell water to take care of those operations, and that $176 an acre foot will take care of that. Now, if we sell interruptible water, that's water above and beyond what we have right now to go forward. If there's a very wet fall, new cash will come in, and we can use those dollars to supplant the firm water rate. So if we have a great wet fall, wet spring, and those dollars we hope to keep our rate to go back down next year and maybe create some sort of a bank for that going forward. So people don't want to pay more. It's a challenge, but I think that as we have firmer water has gotten firmer and interruptible water has gotten more interruptible, we'll have some conversation around rates in the future. But we really have to have this conversation change a little bit, which is the way you're able to build new supply, whether it's groundwater for conjunctive use, whether it's using effluent in a more creative way, whether it's transportation. You have to have a rate structure that supports that so you can bond against it. And so as we go forward, there's going to have to be some real honest conversations about if you want to have security in water, you got to pay for it, or you're going to put yourself in a tight spot. And I think most Texans, because of this drought, are sympathetic and aware, but we need to take advantage of it in a positive way to make sure the infrastructure is there for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Ed, you used rates to drive water use or conservation. You might want to take just a second and talk about some of those concepts.
We did. As part of our long-term plan that I talked about, we decided that we had to change the rate structure significantly, and we developed basically a conservation rate structure. What it is, because so much water is used outdoor in El Paso in the summertime, not only for irrigation, but also a lot of people still have the evaporative coolers that come on. There's a lot of water used because that's an outside structure, but it's actually in the home as far as the use, but it's a lot of use, and so the rate structure we had was inappropriate. So it's based on an average winter consumption of December, January, February. That sets your base, and then you control how much water you want to pay for in the summertime based on 3 blocks. The other thing I did, which I saw that as we start going down in per capita consumption, obviously revenue is going to go down unless we really watch that rate structure carefully. So I think in 91, 92, I went to the board because we had to get the water rights. We had to build facilities that I talked about. We established a water supply replacement charge based on the size of the meter. And we continue that today, and that added to the fixed charge. We still have the fixed charge or the minimum bill, which pays for meter reading and billing. Whether you use any water or not, we have a fixed charge. So today, I think about 55% of the bill of the water bill is fixed. Then we paid very close attention to Block 1. We wanted everybody to pass through Block 1 in the summertime, and when we raised rates, we actually have increased most of it in Block 1, because as we started increasing rates in Block 2 and 3, we started seeing less customers in Blocks 2 and 3, because in Block 3 they were paying over $5 per 1,000 gallons today. So that's how we structured it. And then the sewer is 90% of that average winter consumption. We figure 90% is going to go down your sewer. So that's fixed year-round. So when you take the 55% plus 100% of the sewer and combine those two funds, which are integrated from an accounting perspective, a lot of our revenue is coming from fixed charges in Block 1.
Good, thank you.
And we've been able to increase the revenue as we've decreased the per capita consumption.
Good, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes, and then I'm going to ask the audience for questions. If any one of you all were king and you could have the legislature make one change from a policy standpoint as it relates to future water supplies, what would it be?
Just one? Man, I got to be king.
How about the top three?
All right, I think a couple. One, we have to reform groundwater regulation as to creating certainty around investment. I mentioned that earlier. There needs to be the ability to have a better process and program than we currently have today. And we have so many groundwater districts. They have such disparate rules and controls and processes. You mentioned, as mentioned earlier on in the introductory remarks, on how much water we have in Bastrop and Lee counties. That's a resource of the state. Properly should be used, and we should develop and have some processes to that. And it's under a small group of control in this process that really limits the opportunity. The second thing I would do is I'd want to have a conversation around the state's proper role in creating infrastructure or transmission. You take a look at how transmission works for electricity. Companies go in, they go to the PUC, they say we need a power line built. You build a power line, they get a rate of return. I think there ought to be a conversation, a thought process on transportation and transmission for water the same way, where either a company and or the state can have that conversation and say, we have water from point A, we need to get it to point B. We'll allow you to make that investment, and or the state will, much like a highway. And that's then developed, and water can be transported and priced accordingly, whether it's like just in time or peaker or baseload water created like baseload power. I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that, but it's a conversation the legislature, I believe, ought to consider to take up on both of those fronts.
That is a wonderful idea, both of them. Anybody else want to respond? Ed?
I'll add to the groundwater law. I think there is discussion going on now at TWCA and others on changes to groundwater law. There's some contentious issues not being resolved, but one of them I think seems to be somewhat of a consensus to allow for 30-year permits rather than 5-year permits. You can't issue debt with a 5-year permit, but I think that'll help. On the other part, I'm not sure if it's going to be any change this session or not. A couple other things. I really think that the state ought to invest more in innovation and technology in water. As a country, we don't spend that much per capita on water technology or research. Now, I'm not talking about research, but if you were to identify what are the top barriers, to water, and some of them could be policy issues, and some of them can be technical issues, and go to work on them. For example, in brackish desalination, we need a lot more technology to help us with the concentrate, how we deal with concentrate, as an example, and so that needs to be done as well. And I think that would advance Texas, really into technology and innovation, with regard to that, and help a lot of utilities. The third one is a lot more support for education across the state of Texas on water. Very few people still know where their water comes from, much less, what they pay for. They just turn it on. It's always going to be there. You don't want to get to where you have an emergency, but that's possible, I think, in this country. given not only the stresses in Texas, but the stresses in California and basically many parts of the country. So we've been fortunate that you just turn on the tap and it comes out, but you have to make sure that that happens and people are much more aware. Go ahead.
Kent?
Well, if I'm king, I'm not sure why we need the legislature, for starters, but let's assume that's the case. We need more surety in groundwater districts. I mean, we work with probably what I consider one of the very best and most stable and the oldest districts in the state. But you get a new general manager and a new board, and it's a new game, and we've got a lot of eggs in our groundwater basket. So that concerns me for the long term.
John, you want to do away with interbasin transfer regulations?
I actually, when you sit back and, no, I like it. But when you sit back and you look at Texas, and if Texas is going to grow like it's projected to grow, we've got to change the way that we manage water in this state. And it's both groundwater and surface water, because they're both two different systems at opposite ends of the spectrum. And we've got to be able to use, you know, I think you said we have enough water in this state. We've just got to be able to put it together and use it. You know, the legislature in '97 put together in the planning process with Senate Bill 1. Last session, they put in the key to the funding. We've now got to get the key, the piece of the puzzle in there where we can manage and use conjunctively both water supplies.
Good. Okay. Anybody have any burning questions they want to ask?
Thank you, Joe. The volume of potable and harvestable, the volume of potable and harvestable water in Bastrop County is debatable. Surface water resources recharge in a matter of days, weeks, or even years. Aquifers, sand and gravel aquifers particularly, recharge in centuries or millennia without human help. So what I'm wondering is, Phil and others, is it time for us to get serious about significant aquifer recharge as the basis for meaningful conjunctive use in the state? Could we use our aquifers as water banks to ameliorate the effects of drought? Well, I think that's a great idea. I think one of the challenges we've got, I know it was mentioned for TWCA, they're taking up is right now, and let me educate the audience a little bit if I could. This is a very sophisticated audience for anybody who's not. The concept being, let's say we had the rainstorm last night and things just went full bore. We would like to consider having an aquifer storage type facility where you take it and you have a, let's call it a 30 to 50 acre footprint, and you have a series of wells and you drill those down and it pumps the water in there, and then when we're in the times like now, it pumps it back up to use when as needed. Right now, on the public policy side, it's not clearly delineated who owns that water. So if LCRA had that water and we moved it to Bastrop County until the legislation's fixed, it now potentially, in some people's mind, becomes the groundwater district's water. Well, that's not very cool. They just moved all that water and spent all that money and we pumped it. So I think there's some legislative reform. The issue we've got to talk through in addition to the policy side is it's very energy intensive in order to pump in and out in that process. But as far as part of the overall portfolio of having that conversation and using it where the aquifer makes sense, where you've got the right bases around it, where you don't have seepage, you don't lose it out, and you've got to go through all the geology involved with that. I think it's a tremendous idea and what we've got to look at along with all the other things that the panelists talked through.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Lassiter, and I'm a green building and renewable energy professional. So I move a lot in the renewable energy space. So interesting that you're talking about water like electricity, because we're seeing a lot of movement towards distributed generation. And I would just like to hear some of your thoughts on how we can encourage a lot of distributed water. I'm talking about gray water reuse, rainwater collection, and also decentralized wastewater treatment.
Anybody want to pick up on that?
Conceptually, we're having a lot of conversations on distributed renewable generation, which basically you're putting a solar panel or a windmill on your house, and then you're sending it back into the grid. That's kind of where electricity is going in a lot of places right now. And then the idea is how much do you get paid back in that process of the power side. I think all those things have to be part of the conversation. There is such a challenge to how we get it at the right time, right kind, right price involved with that, and the location. So I think that's the next generation play. I think we've got to solve for some of the bigger supply issues, but I think as you look 10, 15, 20 years, that people want to have more ownership of that. And if there are the right economic incentives for them to put that into play, like you would have for DRG, I think the city of Austin or others would have to look at that as a retail side, or my party participants up here to say, yeah, they have the right program for that, and it's worth it for them to make the investment to have an individual put that in and then get paid back as they come out. But I think it's part of the concept. I think all these ideas have merit. They have to be talked through, whether it's ARS or a distributed type model.
You know, I think Ed's comment about the state needs to spend more time and effort on education. If that happens, that probably will lead to, for instance, municipalities being in a position to authorize use of gray water for irrigation and those sorts of things. I think we're going to have to do that. Any other questions? Or anybody else want to respond to that question? Yes, sir.
Oh, there we are. My name is Bob Keir. We've heard about the need to be able to move water around the state, reform surface and groundwater laws to improve our situation. Related to that is it in the best interest of the people in the state of Texas to consider surface water under one set of laws, groundwater under a different set of laws, and most particularly, should groundwater be a private property right?
I'll take a shot at part of it. I think if you were to start over, I think you would have groundwater not being a private property right. You know, we're the only western state that has basically private property rights. I think, you know, when you start getting into big population growth like the state is experiencing, you start seeing these conflicts and, like you said, the difference between surface water. And, you know, where I'm at, we're part of a compact, part of a Rio Grande project, so it's a federal project. And yet we're caught between federal law and state law in Texas and state law in New Mexico. That's why you have the litigation that's ongoing now with Texas against New Mexico, because New Mexico's pumping the underflow in New Mexico, and they're not delivering as much the water they should to Texas. And so that's become litigation. New Mexico says that's our water, it's virgin groundwater, but what I think shows up, and the federal government is kind of gone along with Texas so far, is that you are impacting this underground surface water flow. So it's just the conflicts that we have in our laws and how this country was developed. So if you were to start from scratch, I think that having water, underground water, not owned by the private property would be a much better model for the state of Texas. But you're dealt the hand you have, so we have to deal with what we have.
You know, I'm the moderator, so I have the benefit of controlling the schedule, and we are at an end. I also have the benefit of being able to give you an idea that I think is important. To me, what is driving our inability to move water around and to use water conjunctively in this state all gets back to economics. People do not want to lose the basic economic driver of water from their area. And so they are prone to hoard it and not let it move. So it would seem to me that if you approached it from an economic standpoint and you let water move in this state in such a way that there are no economic losers, and if you could structure a way where everyone could win if water moves, and I'm talking about municipalities perhaps paying more than they otherwise would for the benefit of the area where water comes from, such that that income stream could be used for infrastructure development or whatever that area might desire, that might make water movement in this state a little more achievable.
Mr. Beal, if I could add one thing on the private property rights question, which I find fascinating. If I own that land, I'm not able to use all my water. So I think my private property rights to some degree are not being fully recognized or honored as well. Because I've got a group of people, wherever you are in a county, that have been appointed to sit on a board to make that determination for how I use my private property. So I think if we go back in time, you probably would do it over in a way, but I think there's an inherent challenge that you have one group of people saying, well, it's ours, it's our private property, we don't want to dispatch it or sell it. But if I own that land, I'm still not able to fully utilize it. I'm still restricted. The utilization of how I want to use mine through a process which many times is fairly arbitrary.
If I could respond just briefly. We have oil and gas as a private property right in the state. Yet we have created a large bureaucracy to manage it for the benefit of the state and make it last. Is the way to keep groundwater a private property right to create another Water Railroad Commission of Texas.
I don't know if it's necessarily with the bureaucracy, but I do think we have to have some systemic changes to how we do it because access is limited. So if I own my royalty, if I own that property and I have the mineral rights, now being the water rights, and I'm being held to a standard where another body or at a county level or two county level has said that's all you get, and in 5 years I'll tell you again, you can't get any more, or I'm going to reduce your allocation because it's being held to that. It's very hard to make that investment. You're not really using the resource you've got. So if you want to take oil and gas, which is perfect, look at the Eagle Ford Shale. It's just, the growth is tremendous. Clyde's next in your backyard, where it's going right now, and out towards San Angelo. That's a valuable asset which has economics, to Joe's point, on where that could go as it's dispatched, and the government's not in charge once it leaves the earth where it's going to go. It has a chance to move. It has that transmission. It has a system being created to that. So we got to have those conversations about once it is yours, you can leave it and then go market it, sell it, do what you want to do with it. That's how the private market works.
And I would suggest to you that during this legislative session and maybe ones to follow, that debate is going to happen and is going to be discussed. Okay, I want you all to join me and thank this panel for being with us today. These guys all have important jobs, and several of them have traveled a great distance. It's been a couple of days just to be with us at lunch, so we really, really appreciate you all coming up. Sarah, you want to end up? Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and of course, a huge thank you to these gentlemen here up on stage, and as well to Paul Thornhill and Kendall Bennett for helping us with today's program. I'm Sarah Richards. I'm the Executive Director of the Colorado River Alliance. I think what today's presentation really reveals is that while our river and water resources across the state are under some pretty significant stress, we have leaders, many of you here in this room, and of course our panelists that are knowledgeable, forward-thinking, and absolutely dedicated to managing the water needs of the entire state, and also to ensuring that our rivers remain healthy and remain flowing for generations to come. And I think what today's presentation also really reveals is that water in Texas is very complicated. And sadly, it's so complicated that the average Austinite walking around today after last night's beautiful show by Mother Nature thinks, we're great, things are good, I don't need to conserve any longer, I don't need to invest in infrastructure to keep our waterways flowing. But that's where the Colorado River Alliance comes in. We are absolutely committed to being an active voice for a healthy Colorado River, and we are here to demystify the complicated topic of water for thousands of Texans every year. And we do that through our two core efforts. And the first is what you're here taking part in right now, our Alliance engagement programs, where we bring you, our community leaders, into this high-level discussion on water. And so I want to give a huge thank you to our event sponsors that are here today, because without them, we couldn't provide this amazing dialogue for folks. A huge thank you to 4-Star, our generous underwriter of this event, and as well to Plains Capital Bank, to Biggerstaff Heath Delgado Acosta, and to Beal Consulting and Mr. Joe Beal. And of course, a big thank you to Mr. Bob Barstow and the Barstow Foundation for investing in these engagement programs. And our second core effort at the Alliance is we provide free, in-depth water education for youth. And I think it'll surprise you, but believe it or not, the conversations we have with those 3rd and 5th grade students are very similar to the conversation we had with you here today. And we're very honored to have some key program partners here with us, and I'd like to thank them for the support of our youth programs. And some big game changers for us are LCRA, who has really invested in our organization, and Samsung. These guys are real game changers for us, so thank you. And additional thanks to 3M and to CH2M Hill, who are investing in one of our new programs that's going to launch later this year, the Mobile River. And both of our efforts, our Alliance engagement programs and our youth programs, are supported by our members, our Colorado River allies. These are our Tributary League and River Society members who, through their support, we are able to provide programs like we have here today. You know, each day our Alliance grows, and it's only through this growth and through increasing our connections with corporate entities and with individuals like yourself that we're able to provide some real impact on our Colorado River. And we have a fantastic year ahead of us. And those of you that are parents in the audience, you know that the school year just kicked off for kids across the city and across the state. And when the school year kicks off, that's when our year kicks off. And we have a fantastic year of exciting and engaging programs, and it's expanded above anything we've ever done before. And so as I mentioned a moment ago, we're launching the Texas-Colorado River Mobile Learning Experience, which will reach over 8,000 students and community members each year. And we want you to be a part of the excitement, and we intend to bring you in on it. So expect news on some of our member-only Mobile River launch events that will take place in the winter and in the spring. It's going to be really exciting, and you'll get a sneak peek of this amazing Mobile River. And thanks to all of our committed members, we're also able this year to expand our Alliance engagement programs. So in the spring, we will have another Barstow event like today's, and we really do hope you'll join us at it. But in addition to that, we are absolutely thrilled to announce that we are holding our second Colorado River bus tour this November. So what this is a 2-day invitation-only trip from Austin to Brownwood and back, where we stop at least a dozen places along the way, and we engage with countless experts, all for the purpose of increasing the dialogue and educating folks on what we need to do to work on these challenges our river faces. So clearly we have a lot of amazing programs ahead, and we want you to join us and be just as excited as we are about these programs. And there's several ways you can do that. You can volunteer at one of our programs or events. You can go out there and talk to folks. Make sure they understand that here in Austin, their drinking water comes from the Colorado River. And of course, you can donate to the organization. You have the ability to do that here today. You've got a little slip like this on your table, and we'd love for you to make a one-time gift. You can also indicate to us on the back there the types of events you're interested in, and we'll contact you and tell you a lot more about what we have going on. More importantly, I hope you'll become one of our allies. We'd like for you to become a member of our group. And our Alliance membership drive is kicking off the beginning of next month, and you will be receiving information about how you can get involved, and we really do hope that you will. So, to close this out, it's been an amazing program. Thanks to each of you for participating in this extremely important dialogue. And of course, a huge thank you again to our panelists and all of our presenters. We hope you go out there and enjoy the river, and we see you out there on it very soon. So thank you.